both of those shows did features on the Glenn Gould Gathering, and part of the film coverage from those shows is being collected with other coverage of last night's dinner and other events. And again, I remind those of you who are Canadians to try to watch the news, which I think on Sunday is called Sunday Report. And there is supposed to be, 10 o'clock tonight, there is supposed to be a feature on the Glenn Gould Gathering. So hopefully we'll all be on TV tonight. I think this is the panel discussion that many people have been very interested in. It's, of course, one aspect of Glenn Gould's life that people find particularly fascinating. And when we were thinking in terms of the leadership of this particular panel, we had no difficulty at all in deciding as a programming group who ought to be the chair. Someone once told me a joke when I was a kid and said he ran into a psychiatrist and he said good morning to him, and the psychiatrist wondered, what does he mean by that? And so when I first was told that I was going to meet a guy by the name of David Goldbloom, I thought, oh, here we go, another one of those fellows. I better watch what I say. I find myself now having no reservations talking to the doctor at all, although what he probably knows about me is far greater than I think he knows about me. And someday he may help me through another crisis. But one interesting thing that I just had a signal from Steve Posen about. Steve says, John, there's one thing you're saying that you ought not to be saying. And he said, I'll support you if you change. So I'm changing, doctor, on what I'm saying here. But Steve says I should not speak in public to folks like yourselves about when or if we have another gathering. I should speak about the fact that we will have another gathering sometime in the future, which is great, and I'm glad to hear that. Anyway, Dr. Goldbloom is a most valued member of the board of directors of the Glenn Gould Foundation. He is a professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto. His title at one of the most important psychiatric institutions in our country, which we still remember as just the Clark Institute. I know it has a new name, and I know, David, that you have a new title there, but it's a very long title that basically says he's a very important man. And when I look at him, and I think he's younger than I am.
Poobah is the title.
Poobah, in a Gilbert and Sullivan sense. The fact is that we are happy, we're terribly grateful that we have David on the board. And so when the committee said, let's have this session in Glenn Gould and the doctors, again, just as it was with some of the other people like Karen and Bill who are here right now, and Bernie, there was no question that this one ought to be led by Dr. David Goldbloom. So David, we welcome you and the panel, and we look forward to Glenn Gould and the doctors.
Thank you very much, John. Actually, I think that one of the main reasons that I'm chairing this panel is that I'm one of the few registrants at this entire symposium who carries a pager. Now, that makes me either a doctor, a plumber, or a drug dealer, one of those three. I can assure you I did go to medical school. Firstly, welcome to all of you to this final session this morning on Glenn Gould and the doctors. I suppose some of you may be sharing with me some regret that we didn't have the guts to walk up onto the stage last night and join that wonderful choir in the singing of the fugue. But like many of you, I've taken an early retirement from the concert stage, so I sat at my dinner table and just enjoyed the music. It is part of the bittersweet fate of people who are celebrities in one form or another, that after their death, and sometimes even during their life, they're the subject of extraordinary scrutiny. And we have an insatiable need to understand the inexplicable. And that inexplicable is indeed part of the genius of someone like Glenn Gould. And it's also, I think, true that as many perspectives as one can obtain on a complex person like Glenn Gould, they never completely finish off the mosaic in terms of understanding. When I was a medical intern at McGill University, working at the Jewish General Hospital, I was always very struck in the autopsy room by something that was inscribed on the walls, which said, "Here in the presence of death, we humbly seek the secrets of life." And that really was the motivating factor, even in that context, for trying to understand what happened and why. At the same time, we have a tendency to pathologize in medicine, to look for what is wrong. And it misses, I think, when we look at somebody like Glenn Gould, what the late Peter Ostwald so beautifully described as the ecstasy of genius. So that I hope today, in the presentations by our distinguished panelists, we will be able to tap into those extraordinary strengths, as well as the frailties and the difficulties that he, like all of us, experienced in the trajectory of life. Our panel today has been carefully chosen. It represents neurology, psychiatry, psychology, musicology, all at the doctoral level, and with a focus that extends from the hand to the brain, to the mind, to the psyche, all of which one might think are interconnected in an effort to understand Glenn Gould. My simple task is really to introduce our speakers, allow them the time that we've agreed upon to make their presentations to you, give them some time to interact with each other, and then open the floor to questions from the audience to our distinguished guests. What I'm going to do is introduce each one of them just prior to their own presentation, so their backgrounds are clear in your minds as they speak. And we've agreed upon a batting order. I did threaten to shuffle it at the last minute, but we did think there was some coherence in the presentation sequence. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Frank Wilson. And he is, to anyone who is familiar with Glenn Gould, a familiar name. He's the Associate Clinical Professor of Neurology at the University of California School of Medicine in San Francisco. And along with the late Peter Ostwald, was co-founder of the program for performing artists at UCF Stanford. Dr. Wilson has lectured all over the world and published extensively on the neurological aspects of human musicality. And a very fruitful period of time that he spent in Germany, in Dusseldorf, a decade ago, has enhanced his understanding of the hand, and particularly the hand in the context of music. He's the author of Tone Deaf and All Thumbs, with a question mark, and his most recent book, The Hand, has just been issued in a paperback edition that I encourage you to pick up. So our first speaker this morning is Dr. Frank Wilson. Welcome, Frank.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to, first of all, just begin by saying that it is a matter of some sorrow to me that Peter Ostwald, my longtime friend and colleague, couldn't be here. If he were alive, he would be sitting here and we'd be knocking heads as we did over a long period of time. I also want to thank Peter for another reason. He and Robert Silverman were the two individuals who started me on a search for an answer which I'm going to try to, or some interesting questions which I'm going to present to you this morning, by asking me to read the Glenn Gould Diary, which was written in 1977 and 1978. I'm sure that almost everyone here knows something about the diary, although it's never been published. I also want to acknowledge considerable support that has come to me over the period that I began to look into the issue of Glenn Gould's hand problems, particularly Steve Posen representing the estate, Tim Maloney from the National Library, and also Ray Roberts and his brother John Roberts. Sorry. But both of them who have provided me lots of background information and insight and also then to Bruno Monsejean and Humphrey Burton, who both personally and through their films have given me a great deal of important information. So I'll now, having said that, try to give you the story that has developed through this work in a nutshell. And I'd like you, as I present this information, to understand that this is a work in progress, as I think is all research on Gould. I've decided to sort of break down what I want to tell you into three subheadings. First of all, I'm going to make some purely descriptive statements about Glenn Gould in relation to some musculoskeletal issues, some things that I think need to be said about his hand and his arm. Now, musicians are not typically particularly concerned in the body as a robotic structure, not as athletes are or as perhaps dancers are. In fact, it's been my experience that musicians are a bit phobic about that issue. They would rather not try to understand how the hand and the arm work because it's too complicated and it would get in the way. But the fact of the matter is that music making is also a highly physical and a physically intensely demanding activity, and things can go wrong, and when they do go wrong, it's important to understand that. Biomechanics is part of the story, and so I'm going to talk descriptively about what I think must be said about Glenn Gould. Secondly, there are some other statements that I want to make which are really inferential statements which connect some of these descriptive statements to a rich and diverse body of information about his musical career and also about his experiences with doctors over the years. And then finally, I want to raise just a few questions that I think should be of extraordinary interest to more than one group of people. There's sort of broadly the constituency of medicine, and there is a group within medicine, a special interest group, the performing arts medicine community, who take on the responsibility of helping musicians who are in trouble. I think Glenn Gould's career raises questions that are extremely important to that group. And also, I think by inference to teachers as well, because much of what we learn about the problems of musicians, I think needs to be, if I may say so, plowed back into the teaching process so that injuries and medical problems that are avoidable could be avoided. If this information is made available to young students, I think it clearly has the potential for an enormous impact on the health and well-being of young artists. The other questions that I want to raise, and I think should perhaps have a much more long-lasting impact on discussions, are some questions that I think are essentially musicologic. I'm not a mind-body separatist. I know we're going from the hand to the brain, but I don't think they're disconnected. I think they're a system. That's what my most recent book is about. You can't talk about the hand without talking about the brain. You cannot talk about the brain of humans without talking about the hand. So with that introduction, here's what I want to tell you about Glenn Gould. First of all, he had an extreme disadvantage in the biomechanics of his hand. The specific disadvantage is easily described to all of the Trekkies in this audience. You remember Mr. Spock and the famous sign. Glenn Gould, based on a lot of evidence that I have been able to gather over a period of some years, had a significant reduction in the lateral flexibility of the digits of his hand. His third and fourth fingers moved laterally almost as a single finger. He had no limitation in vertical movements of the hand, but and I would invite those of you who are interested in the films to go back and look at these. I've spent countless hours reviewing these videos, and it is, I will say this, I will go to the mat with this, he had a very particular biomechanical problem in his hand which had, I believe, a profound effect on his ability to play and the work that he did at the keyboard. The second thing that I will say, which I feel fairly strongly about but is much more difficult to document, is that he also had a reduction in pronation range of the forearm. Now, to explain that to you, if you simply hold your own hand in front of you, if you turn your hand palm up, that's called supination. And it's important for violinists and guitar players to have free supination range because they have to have a relaxed position in the hand in order to move the fingers on the fretboard or on the neck of the instrument. For pianists, it's really the other way around. It's important to be able to, without using high forces, get the hand level on the keyboard. I believe that Gould had a very low pronation range, and that he, as is typical of pianists who have that problem, really had to get comfortable with the piano by elevating his arms. The pronation range that is achieved by moving the elbows away from the side allows the hands to lie flat without force on the keyboard. And I feel reasonably confident about that, but as with the problem in the hand, it would be far better were he here to make those measurements. He's not here. But I think that the evidence is very, very good from the video record and from his own personal reports about his experience playing certain kinds of literature. The third thing I want to say is that I also think that he had a condition which, in the reports that I've read, certainly was suspected by some of the people who treated him, and it goes under the name variously thoracic outlet syndrome, neurovascular entrapment syndrome. But what it really means is that the major structures, the neurologic structures, the brachial plexus, which is a big set of nerve trunks at the side of the neck that crosses under the collarbone and goes out in the arm, that it becomes entrapped because of postural changes in the upper back and in the neck. The result is that these nerve trunks don't move freely, and typically people who have this problem have complaints of arm pain. They also have complaints of numbness and tingling in their hands, and they also complain of cold hands. There's no question in my mind that many of the complaints that he had about his hands and his arms were related to this syndrome as well. Now, these are three entirely different problems, and yet they had a synergistic effect on him. And I believe that you cannot read about his career and his problems and to what I think has been widely thought to be a certain hypochondriasis on his part as being in fact more consistent with someone trying to do something extraordinarily difficult at the keyboard in the face of nearly insurmountable physical obstacles to achieving those goals. Now, the inferences to be drawn from this are, first of all, that he and I think I've already said one of them, was that even though he may have been, as some people say, hypervigilant, overly attentive to, overly bothered by physical sensations, the fact of the matter is that you can look far more charitably on this and say that if we had known then what we know now, that he could have been spared an enormous amount of pain and physical disability. It's also possible that his departure from the stage at the early age that it occurred might have been prevented. Certainly in my own practice, which goes back about 15 years, the musicians that I've seen who've had any one of these problems have, without help, been essentially precluded from a significant performance career. The second inference that I would make, and there's been some discussion here about this already, is that he may have had a syndrome which has been called focal dystonia, or musician's cramp. There's a great deal of evidence, I think, in the diary that he certainly was beginning to develop the symptoms which, had they progressed, would have led to what is called focal dystonia, and this is virtually 100% disabling. And in 1977-78, he was working with Mont Saint Jean, as you heard and as you know, but he was also working on his hand, and he was trying to figure out what was wrong with his hand. And his description of the control problems that he was having really fit essentially perfectly into that category. But since he went on to continue to play and completed his career with the recording of the Goldberg Variations, one then has to ask, did he solve the problem? Did he fight it to a draw? What was really the condition of his playing ability in the light of these problems at the end of his career? The next question, which I believe the next category really is the questions that we're left with. The questions that we're left with are the ones that I think are important for us who care for musicians, the doctors who look at these problems. If he did have a focal dystonia, or if he did have significant physical problems related to playing, can we learn anything from this documentary record that he left us that would help us do what we need to do, which is to prevent these problems from coming up again in other musicians? That's something that I think we have to work on. But the other, and for me, the really intriguing question as the mind-body non-separatist that I've described myself to be, is to ask a number of questions about his career. I will tell you that in 15 years, I've probably seen 10 other musicians with hands whose biomechanics are like his. And all of them confined themselves to precisely the literature that Glenn Gould played during his career. They essentially were unable to manage the Romantic literature, particularly the very percussive chordal literature. What they played in the Romantic literature was essentially what we've heard Gould play here, which are pieces, for example, the Beethoven concertos that he played, that consists of a lot of passage work, which is easily managed with a hand that is held in a relatively close-fingered position. The even more interesting question to me, which I think will never be resolved, but which fascinates me, again, as the person who believes that the body and the mind are one, is that much of his work as a musician and his development as a specialist represents a channeling of his musical impulses and his musical geniuses through a relatively narrow part of the musical literature. And I think it's extraordinary that, that his contribution to music, given the difficulties that he had, is as singular and significant as it really is. Can one make the assertion, or can even one dare ask, that his opinions about certain composers really in fact represent the inevitable consequence of his exclusion from a career that would involve significant performance of those works? I'm not prepared to make that assertion. But I think these are interesting questions, and the really take-home message is that I think the more we look at him, the more we can be sympathetic with the degree to which he fought a battle for his entire life against, I think, overwhelming odds, and he did so in isolation, because I don't think that people around him, at least the medical people around him, fully appreciated, and they can't be accused of anything wrong for this, because we know more now. It's really, it is an interesting irony that the year he died was the year that we learned about the problems of Gary Graffman and Leon Fleischer, and it's only because of the wide disclosure of this information that we are coming to appreciate what an extraordinary physical challenge it is for musicians to do what they do. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that enthusiastic response to what I think is the first of 4 provocative presentations. I'm glad that Frank has challenged any concept of mind-body dualism. If you will, he's laying Descartes on the table. But at the same time, he's posed some very provocative questions for us and for our panel and for you in the audience. Really, does disability shape repertoire? Does this kind of difficulty shape what what's viewed by many people as a central decision in the course of Glenn Gould's career around concertizing in public versus being in the studio? And I'm sure that our other panelists are going to have some thoughts about that. Our next speaker is a local talent, if you will, of an international pedigree, Dr. Helen Mesaros. Dr. Mesaros is a psychiatrist here in Toronto at Toronto East General Hospital, where she has served as the director of the intensive psychotherapy program for the last 18 years. She comes to us from Yugoslavia, where she studied both medically and studied pianistically before coming to Canada in 1971 and completing her training in psychiatry at the University of Toronto. She has been a contributor to previous symposia and film events related to the life of Glenn Gould, and has a major manuscript giving her perspective on an understanding of Glenn Gould's life. So Helen, I invite you now to the podium.
Thank you, David. In the course of my lengthy research related to Glenn Gould, I had a wonderful opportunity to meet and interview several of Gould's relatives. I saw his father and stepfather many times. I saw and interviewed his 3 cousins also several times, 1 aunt and 2 of his nannies, as well as a number of his friends and associates. They all helped me to understand Glenn's inner world in some depth and to put together and understand the origins of his many emotional problems. And this is what I'd like to do today with you, to share with you some of my findings. To be ill or to be healthy was a perpetual question in Gould's subconscious mind throughout his life. From the time he was a tiny boy, Glenn had to struggle with the fear of the dark and fear of germs and catching a cold. At the age of 6, 2 more problems developed in his life. They were school phobia and phobia of fishing. By the age of 8 and 9, he already suffered tension headaches and repeated episodes of stomach aches. I consider these 3 conditions, school phobia and his tension headaches and stomach aches, to be actually offshoots of his very strong underlying separation anxiety. And separation anxiety had to do with separating from his mother on a daily basis. He was very attached to his mother, and this was a challenge for him to go to school and separate from her and from his familiar environment at home, where he had his pets, his beloved piano, his living room, his comfort. Glenn discovered at that time that his stomach pains, at least, could be alleviated by him using soda mints, swallowing them orally. This set a precedent for his future pill-taking behavior in his adulthood. None of these conditions, none of these phobias and anxieties were resolved on his childhood level, but they tended to be carried into his teens. At that time, when Glenn was between ages of 16 and 18, he developed a habit of wearing layers of clothes and fingerless gloves as a defense against illness. His mother was very ashamed of that, but his teacher, Alberto Guerrero, condoned such behavior, saying something like that, well, if he has pains in his hands, he should really wear those gloves in order to protect them. Again, these emotional hang-ups were also carried into the next developmental stage, into his young adulthood. In his early 20s, Gould moved to his family cottage on Lake Simcoe, where he lived a life of a relative social isolation. This is when his communication at a distance began. And he did have a very rich correspondence at that time, and also his phone calls from his cottage to his friends were very, very frequent. His creative work was always intertwined with his many emotional upheavals. They always went hand in hand. At the cottage, Glenn used to stay up late at night, listening to the music and reading his scores and books, often going to bed at the crack of the dawn. He was a real night hawk, but not by choice, but he had to somehow conquer his persistent dread of the dark. And that was one of the ways of coping. By staying up awake, he was simply able to control his fear of the dark and then go to bed early in the morning when he was quite relaxed. At the same time, Glenn started experiencing pains and aches in his hands, and he was convinced that he had developed a condition called fibrositis, which is marked by stiffness and swollen joints of his fingers, fingers. In this case, he thought that he had it. While at the cottage, Glenn became more thin and more untidy than ever before. He lacked appetite, and he developed poor eating habits, which both continued to bother him for the rest of his life. While the man was starving and perspiring in warm clothes, the musician in Gould was thriving. He rehearsed and perfected many music pieces in anticipation of his great concert career. In this decade, that is when he was in his 20s, which happens to be his most intense performing decade, he developed symptoms of stage fright and early signs of depression. Gould's stage fright was not really recognized adequately by his contemporaries because it did not present in its typical form of shakes or visible panic, but rather in a disguised form of many physical ailments. In young adulthood, Gould's career as a touring artist became combined with his habit of frequenting physicians and chiropractors in those cities where he performed. Two new conditions developed at that time: hypochondria, which is obsessive preoccupation with own bodily symptoms, and bouts of depression. Though he was referred to seek psychiatric care, he relentlessly steered himself in direction of looking for concrete physical illness and for hands-on treatment. How depressed Glenn was at the time, which was in his mid-20s, is very well portrayed in his letters to his friend in Detroit, who invited him to spend time with him at Christmas. Glenn wrote, "Dear Ted, September 9, 1958. I'm sure that you will not find it too unsociable if I discourage all ideas of entertainment at Christmas. I shall be just back from Europe, undoubtedly exhausted. Bracket, I am exhausted before I leave. Bracket. And I have a feeling that I would not be in any frame of mind for socializing at that time. So please, no dinners, no parties, no interviews, no photographers, no autograph hunters, and no stage door Janes." His statement, "I'm exhausted before I leave," is really telling. It indicates how depressed and tired, how much he lacked energy, he lacked zest to pursue this, any social interchange. And along with his need for social withdrawal, all these things were really merely but signs of his depressive disorder. Gould's parting from his performing career in 1964 was a result of his ailing mental health, in my opinion. For some years, he struggled with depression, which was untreated, and pursued many odd behaviors. His anxiety was much too high, and he required sedatives. He was misunderstood and criticized by the critics, which was a source of ongoing injuries to his self-esteem. He simply could not take it anymore, and he had to quit. In the interest of time, I will now make a leap to the last decade of his life. While in his 40s, Gould had a steady family physician, Dr. John Percival. Yet he shopped around for different specialists, often seeing 3 to 4 physicians at the same time frame. The problem about that was that he did not inform those involved in his care about his concurrent therapies. He used to obtain multiple prescriptions from different physicians and proceeded to take all of those drugs, which act was very potentially self-harming and very risky thing to do. As it turned out, Gould did not have optimal treatment because of this very miscommunication with his caregivers. Ironically, he never received treatment for his recurrent depression, but instead he was prescribed hypnotics like Nembutal for his intractable insomnia. I consider that his insomnia, along with his poor appetite, weight loss, fatigue, despondent mood, these are all principal symptoms of his biochemical depression. Dr. Percival was aware of Gould's hypochondria, but he took it lightly and tried to talk him out of it. His strategy was to provide Gould with a clean bill of health, whereas Gould really fancied ill health. This is one of the reasons why Gould's hypochondria really never got better. Over the last 7 years of his life, Gould developed moderate essential hypertension. This delicate condition was greatly aggravated by his untreated depression and oversensitivity to emotional stress. On the bright side, Gould's vast music talent and his artistic pursuits sustained him throughout his tortured life. His wit, his charm, his charisma, his brilliant intelligence, and particularly his verbal eloquence and artistic expression were his major personality strengths, on which he could always count for his well-being. These strengths helped him stay afloat and carry on his extraordinary performing career for 9 years and pursue his other remarkable accomplishments for another 18 years until the end.
Thank you, Helen. I think Helen has clearly given us another dimension to Gould's life, but if one tries to weave it together with what Frank has talked about, the need for control in response to the depression, in response to the hypochondria, in response to the stage fright, the need for control may have similarly shaped some of Gould's decisions around what he played, where he played, and how he lived his life. The irony, of course, is that his well-known doctor shopping, and there is indeed virtually an alumni society of physicians here in Toronto, including my wife's uncle, who at various times attempted to minister to Gould. My wife's uncle tells me that he's a radiologist, and Gould would show up every couple of months requesting a barium enema for examination of his stomach concerns, or as it's known in parts of Nova Scotia, a Bavarian enema. And he never really understood exactly why this procedure was being requested. The results were always normal, and the results were never completely satisfying to the recipient. But doctor shopping as a phenomenon often reflects somebody who has tremendous difficulty relinquishing control to somebody else. And that surrendering of the self to the care of somebody else really would have been, I think, for Gould a courageous step, but a step in the end that he was not ultimately able to make. And so we're left with the tragic irony of somebody who sought to regulate his own health and then was tragically felled by it. Our next speaker is another doctor, Dr. Tim Maloney, although Tim is probably more on call for musicological emergencies at this point. He completed his PhD in music performance and music history at the University of Rochester, and brings not only his academic expertise in that area, but also his stature as the director of the music division at the National Library of Canada since 1988. Tim is one of those people who has not only an intellectual perspective on the subject at hand, but also a musical perspective as a professional clarinetist who's performed under distinguished conductors, including Glenn Gould on the Wagner recording. So he was in that elite group of musicians who had the opportunity to participate in this area. Tim has taught extensively and played extensively, but he brings today his unique personal perspective on Gould with a focus on some of the medical and psychiatric aspects that have been raised in Peter Ostwald's biography. Tim.
Thank you, David. In his book, Glenn Gould, The Ecstasy and Tragedy of Genius, the psychiatrist Peter Ostwald suggested that, quote, some of the behavior Gould manifested later in childhood and during his adolescence resembles a condition called Asperger disease, a variant of autism, end quote. Ostwald, who died of cancer before his book was published, devoted only 3 sentences to this topic. With more time, he may have discussed the issue in greater detail. Having researched the matter exhaustively, I now feel that Asperger's syndrome was at the root of Gould's perplexing behavior as an adult, and I propose to describe some of the principal characteristics of the disease and what I see as their manifestations in Glenn Gould. Asperger's is classed by the American Psychiatric Association in a group of pervasive developmental disorders that share impairments in socialization, communication, and imagination. Sufferers often seem normal in many aspects of daily life, and some even achieve distinction in their chosen fields, but all are considered eccentric because of unusual behavior. Bela Bartok, Ludwig Wittgenstein, Vladimir Nabokov, and Albert Einstein may all have had Asperger's disease, which affects far more men than women. I will briefly discuss 10 traits of Asperger's. 1, inability to interact normally with other humans. Individuals with Asperger's syndrome typically have no close friends, have difficulty behaving in socially accepted ways, and exhibit extremes of behavior regarding hygiene and personal appearance. Most do poorly in school, have difficulty taking direction, and cannot accept criticism. They often lack common sense, are considered odd, and remain socially isolated. Many express greater kinship with animals or machines than with humans. They feel alienated like members of another species. They are incapable of empathy, don't understand love, and few ever marry. Many suffer depression, and some are driven to suicide. Glenn Gould was seen as eccentric and reclusive. He interacted with people only on his terms, took criticism poorly, had few close relationships, many of which ended badly, and never married. He was enamored of technology, i.e. machines, and was inordinately concerned with animal welfare. He neglected his personal appearance, yet he obsessed over his health. 2, intolerance to change. Asperger's sufferers have an obsessive need for sameness. Change causes stress, even panic. In children, imposed change can result in rage, and these individuals may tyrannize their families with their resistance to changes of any kind, for example, to their dress, food, activities, personal items, or schedules. Glenn Gould adapted badly to the changes imposed by traveling and concertizing, to the extent that he developed illnesses on tour and canceled many concerts. Eventually, he stopped concertizing and traveling altogether. He adhered to a very restricted, repetitious diet and wardrobe for many years. He continued to use his own folding piano chair even when wear and tear reduced it to just a frame. He was a perfectionist who needed to control all aspects of his work thereby minimizing unpredictability, eventually producing his own recordings, for example. In his later career, he scripted even the answers for supposedly spontaneous interviews. 3, adherence to elaborate rituals and routines. With young Asperger's patients, ritualized play is common, where toys or other objects are obsessively lined up in single file or in patterns. Such narrowly focused private play, usually involving systemization or repetition, absorbs these children for hours at a time. In adults with Asperger's, the memorization of sports records or historical dates, or the obsessive collecting of meaningless sets of objects are standard. When Glenn Gould was still giving concerts, he would place a small oriental carpet beneath the piano pedals. Before performing, he soaked his hands and arms in extremely hot water. When Gould and Margaret Pachu were preparing to tape a comedy sketch for the Silver Jubilee album, she reported that, quote, "Before we recorded this, he went into the bathroom and washed his hands, and they were scarlet red," end quote. This was apparently a ritual Gould followed before recording sessions, whether he was about to play the piano or not. With regard to unusual collecting habits, Glenn Gould collected many hotel and rental car keys. He also hoarded seemingly every document he ever acquired or used: fan mail, brokerage statements, library books, other people's music scores, checklists for his trips, baggage tags, etc. 4, intense fixations and powers of concentration. Children with Asperger's will fixate exclusively on certain activities. When doing so, they are deaf to all communication, even if their hearing is normal. They can become enraged and violent if forcibly interrupted. As adults, they obsess over their chosen interests, devoting every available moment to them, apparently incapable of true recreation or relaxation. They suffer anxiety. Oh, come on, guys. They suffer anxiety and stress-related health problems. Somebody shoot him. Glenn Gould focused obsessively on work, to the exclusion of any real leisure pursuits. If his parents wanted to punish Glenn when he was young, they locked the piano, which was almost more than he could stand. As an adult, he worked long and unusual hours, often through the night. He suffered chronic anxiety and took prescription medication to combat it. 5, prodigious memory. People with Asperger's typically have photographic memories and are intensely visual thinkers. They can absorb complex designs or large amounts of information in a few seconds and will retain the images vividly for indefinite periods of time. Most have perfect pitch, though not all are musically gifted. Reportedly, Glenn Gould could learn a Beethoven score while carrying on a conversation. That was a quote. And Gould himself claimed that most of his practice time as an adult was spent learning scores away from the instrument. He had perfect pitch, of course, and also remarkable muscular or kinesthetic memory. He could return to a work years after last performing it and play it perfectly. An example of that occurred when, on extremely short notice, he replaced Arturo Benedetti Michelangeli in a television taping of Beethoven's Emperor Concerto with Karl Ancherl and the Toronto Symphony. 6, special talents. Many people with Asperger's have extraordinary abilities in mathematics, music, or art. These talents typically blossom automatically and do not require long development to achieve masterful results. Still, the special abilities rarely evolve beyond the surprising early fluency. Most of these people are able to intuit the essence of whatever they work on quickly, often without focusing or concentrating on it. Though obviously gifted with an extraordinary musical talent, Gould departed from the standard Asperger model in that he evolved as a student and professional over a number of years. His success was enhanced by his intuitive understanding of the structures underlying the works he played. The music he excelled at was that of Bach and other polyphonists, whose contrapuntal textures and formal logic were ideal material for someone gifted at processing large amounts of data simultaneously. On the other hand, some of his most controversial recordings were of music which was less contrapuntal. For example, late Mozart and Beethoven, perhaps due to the lesser ability for sequential processing typical in Asperger's sufferers. 7, intellectual intensity coupled with moral severity. Individuals with Asperger's syndrome tend to have a passionate sense of right and wrong. Coupled with their innate rigidity, they appear naive and out of step with society. They can be extremely pedantic and often lack a sense of humor. Gould sometimes referred to himself as the last Puritan. As a youth, he couldn't stand to hear boys blaspheme or use obscenities. That's a quote from Bob Fulford. In his mature years, Gould was a teetotaling, vegetarian pacifist. While he showed a lively sense of humor through the various fictional characters he created and the accents he parodied, it was offbeat humor, not appreciated by everyone. His theories about tempo relationships, as exhibited in his second Goldberg recording and the Brahms Concerto with Bernstein, were extremely pedantic and affected his performances for the worse in my judgment. 8, abnormal responses to sensory stimulation. People with Asperger's are hypersensitive to certain stimuli and often hyposensitive to others. Temple Grandin, an Asperger's sufferer who has written about her difficult childhood, felt overcome by sensation. That's a quote. She described her ears feeling like, quote, microphones transmitting everything at overwhelming volume, end quote. All her senses were similarly affected, causing her to panic when hugged and to misbehave in church because her Sunday dresses felt so uncomfortable against her skin. Gould's famous hat, scarf, gloves, and winter coat, even in summer, demonstrate an unusual intolerance to cold. He preferred darkness to daylight and disliked bright colors. He threw a tantrum as a child when presented with a shiny red fire truck. His clothing in his mature years was restricted mostly to the narrow color range of gray, navy blue, and black, and his fabrics of choice were soft. The few foods he ate were bland and soft. Though tactile was one of his favorite words, he had an aversion to physical contact, and during his touring years, even had a sign printed to discourage people from shaking his hand. 9, language disorders. Adults with Asperger's have a fluent but idiosyncratic use of language. They tend toward verbosity, exhibiting peculiar discontinuities, sudden changes of topic, and invented vocabulary. They subject others to long monologues on topics of special interest to themselves. Gould was long-winded, fond of obscure words, and sometimes coined his own, for example, the non-take two-ness of concerts. His writing in particular was stilted, prompting 2 critics to describe it as verbal pyrotechnics and affected pedantry. He and his pet topics dominated conversation. 10, poor posture, physical clumsiness, and repetitive movements. Asperger's sufferers often exhibit an odd gait, poor posture, and stereotyped repetitive movements, such as hand flapping and other unusual gestures. Many will avoid direct eye contact. Most are uncoordinated to at least some extent, and are hopeless at group activities, especially ball games and team sports. However, they may have certain motor skills in abundance. They often have writing problems and dyslexia. Bert Gould reported that, quote, if you threw a tennis ball to Glenn, tried to get him to catch it, he'd turn his back and let it hit him, but he wouldn't catch it, never would, end quote. Teams and sports were alien to Glenn. His adult handwriting was a sloppy scrawl, and he was at best mediocre at spelling. His musical notation, too, never progressed beyond a schoolboy's script. When the mature Gould performed, he rocked incessantly at the keyboard, a classic autistic trait, conducted the music with a free hand, and hummed uncontrollably. His teacher and subsequently many music journalists criticized him for his stage antics, which they attributed to showing off. He slouched for most of his life, and he became shockingly round-shouldered and paunchy at age 49 when I worked with him in the summer of 1982. Conclusion. While I have done little more than scratch the surface of this complex topic today, I hope that these observations help place Gould's eccentricities in a new light. Far from being deliberately willful, egocentric, and kooky, I feel he was the victim of a disease he didn't even know he had. No other explanations tie all these things together the way Asperger's seems to do. Viewed in this light, he deserves our sympathy and admiration for functioning as well as he did and for developing on his own all the strategies he used to cope. Thanks for your kind attention.
Tim, I think you've succeeded in adding another layer to the onion as we progress through the neuroanatomic difficulties, through the psychodynamic, conflict-based and relationship-based difficulties, even through to the more biologically based difficulties of autism and related disorders. People need to know that autism really became a formal diagnosis only in the 1940s through the work of Leo Kanner. And subsequently, for a number of years, autism was felt to be, in fact, the consequence of faulty parenting, rather than the biologically based disorder, which it is really universally recognized as now. I've seen a number of patients with Asperger's, and would that they have had the extraordinary talents and successes of someone like Glenn Gould. These illnesses, like Asperger's, in some senses are very much ordinary when they affect ordinary people, and far more debilitating. I think we have a vulnerability always to making connections, particularly between mental illnesses and genius, and the idea that these facilitate in some way the expression of creativity, the classic linkage between manic depressive illness and our extraordinary artistic ability, whereas the mundane reality is that for many people who suffer these kinds of illnesses, the disability and the roadblocks to the expression of their strengths and talents become at times overbearing. But I want to thank you for taking the points sequentially around the diagnosis of Asperger and trying to relate them to Glenn Gould's life. We now move to another realm with Dr. Lynne Walter. Dr. Lynne Walter brings to us both, again, a background in music and a background in psychology, namely Jungian psychology. While she has an undergraduate degree in both music and library science from the University of British Columbia, she completed her doctoral work in clinical psychology at the University of Ottawa, and then postdoctoral studies at the Carl Gustav Jung Institute of Chicago. And in fact, her postdoctoral work there focused on imagining Glenn Gould, a speculative study of his psychology. And she has taken a Jungian perspective, which is very different than some of the other perspectives within psychology, to trying to understand Glenn Gould. And she also brings to this some personal experiences from childhood that I hope she'll be able to share with us. So please welcome Lynne Walter.
By chance, while in Chicago in 1996, I heard a recording of Glenn Gould playing the Goldbergs. Memories flooded my mind of a young man wearing a wool coat, scarf, and cap, roaring across Lake Simcoe in a motorboat on a hot summer sun. My adolescent summers were spent at my parents' cottage around the bend of the lake from the Gould family's summer home. During family strolls, I heard him playing his Chickering piano and felt very much in awe of this brilliant young pianist. Gould was not sociable, and we never were introduced, even though our cottages were so close. Nevertheless, I had seen and heard him, and the possibility of writing a paper on the subject of his psychology interested me very much when I was looking for a dissertation topic. What I learned about Gould was gleaned from all available material about him, including books, newspaper clippings, videos, and recordings. And my final dissertation was based on Gould's behaviors as described in my sources. At this point, I have to say that I'm basically using clinical psychology rather than Jungian work as a framework because of the diagnostic capacities. My research in clinical psychology led me to investigate personality disorders, defined by DSM-4 as an enduring pattern of inner experience and behavior that deviates markedly from the expectations of the individual's culture, manifested in the area of cognition, affectivity, interpersonal functioning, and impulse control. In Glenn Gould, we have a veritable paradox, a man of genius whose musical ability led him to great heights of achievement in his field, but who seemed notably eccentric. For example, his performance behavior was uncharacteristic of most pianists. His audible vocalizations intrude into his recordings, and his life was seriously lacking in social interaction. Consequently, I identified 3 character disorders which could be linked with salient behavioral aspects displayed by Gould. Although no single personality disorder met all the requisite criteria, the 3 together, obsessional, schizoid, and narcissistic, seemed to cast some light on his problematic nature. Gould's obsessional traits include rigid self-control and ideation, his control of his environment, and his striving towards perfection. His concern with precision and his performance-related rituals may have been defensive, but the meticulous, detailed work on his documentaries was healthy and adaptive. His schizoid qualities included detachment, affective isolation, avoidance of intimacy, constricted emotional expression, and desire for solitary activities. However, he enjoyed his relationship with his family and his friendly contacts with his cousin Jessie. His circle of friends was small, but his enjoyment in meeting with a small group of theatrical-minded people continued for years. Comprising Gould's narcissistic traits were his impenetrability and tendency to self-reference, his rejection of interpretations or criticisms by others, his low capacity for empathy, his pride in independence, his grandiosity, his expectation of being entitled to others' services, and his haughty attitude. Some regarded him as exploiting people for his own purposes and dropping them when they were no longer useful. The most appropriate diagnostic category that I found seemed to be a mixed personality disorder. Glenn called himself the last Puritan and was proud of this designation. Indeed, his narcissistic, obsessional, and schizoid qualities all contributed to his moralistic attitude. His Puritanism crossed the spectrum of those conditions. Anthony Storr, a British psychiatrist, offers a context within which to appreciate and value Glenn Gould. Gould had been frequently regarded as odd, and much more pejorative descriptors have been applied to him. In truth, he was odd. But odd or even pathological aspects can be overridden by other factors. Personally, I perceive Glenn Gould as a truly creative individual in many areas. And I'd like to summarize qualities ascribed to many of the world's most creative geniuses. Creative individuals prefer solitude. Solitude is necessary for creativity, as Gould knew very well. He spent much time quietly, alone. The creative individual ignores other people's ideas, choosing to remain an independent thinker. Gould approached each musical work with his own critical sense, and no one else's. Creative people are more interested in their own work than they are in that of others. This suggests that schizoid traits may be frequently found in extremely gifted people. Social communication holds no value for them. Their work is the primary source of their self-esteem. This seems to apply to Glenn, I think. Creative people may live extremely systematic lives, rising, eating the same food day in and day out, and retiring with predictive regularity. Their obsessions, however, do not hold them back from their creativity. In fact, the rituals may contribute to it, as we have seen in Glenn's case. Depressions, phobias, and anxiety are part of the life of creative people. But such people's ability to create seems to enable them to continue in their major interests. Gould struggled with depression and anxieties, and obviously pain, and generally coped adequately. Only when his mother died did his activity lessen. Creative people are frequently ascetic, with little interest in luxurious environments, paying little attention to clothing, and with no extravagant needs. This was typical of Gould. The search for order seems common in creative people. Gould's musical focus was invariably on structure, rather than on the more ordinary focus on melody or harmony. Creative thinkers believe that they are always right. They have complete confidence in their independent judgments. A host of famous people could be mentioned who fit the category of creative thinkers: Einstein, Newton, Kant, Hume, Wittgenstein, Leibniz, Berkeley, Beethoven, Schumann, and I'd like to add Glenn Gould to this list of creative people. All displayed many symptoms that might be labeled as pathological. Curiously, though, not one of them decompensated. There are no reports of hospitalization for any form of mental illness, no manic episodes, no murders or violent outbursts. What was it that maintained an equilibrium that was so stable over time? These creative individuals were passionately devoted to their work, totally involved in it. Nothing else in their life was as important as what they were working on or thinking about. This vital, energizing quality seems to be the glue that enables a vulnerable personality to remain whole. It is a good thing that we have these gifted people. We need our philosophers, our scientists, our musicians, our artists of all persuasions to share with us the intensity of their lives and the richness of their creation. We need them as models to show us how to live, to let us understand that our passion, like Glenn Gould's passion, leads us to become the people we can be. Centered in ourselves and in our passion, we move towards being fully ourselves. Jungians, friendly to paradox, assume that both beneficial and pathological qualities of individuals are valuable. The gifted individuals I mentioned were not always likable, but their impact in their field and on their culture was profound. In conclusion, it seems to me that without the characterological disposition that shaped Gould's, he would have been a less interesting person. Imagine him for a moment as perfectly ordinary, appreciating sociability, respecting others' needs, and disdaining repetitive, detailed aspects of life. In fact, I propose that without his eccentricities, we would not be gathered here as we are today to celebrate and honor the life and the contributions of this curiously Baroque pearl of a Canadian musician, Glenn Gould.
Thank you very much, Lynn. And I think in some measure we can probably all be grateful on the conclusion of these 4 initial presentations by our speakers. We can be grateful that none of us is likely ever to be subject to this degree of post-mortem speculation and analysis. I shudder to think how we would all survive this degree of scrutiny. But I think that there are some common themes that do come through these 4 talks around themes of adaptation and themes of control. Just a comment I'd like to make about Lynn's perspective in relation to personality disorder, that within the diagnostic framework of psychiatry, this is the one area where there is perhaps less scientific certainty around the borderline between normality and pathology. And I think the other important thing to know about so-called personality disorder is that it often doesn't cause distress in the people who have it, but creates havoc in the environment of people around that person. And it tests the limits at times of relationships with the person with personality disorder. But he or she may in fact never seek help and never experience distress, except insofar as relationships are compromised. I'm reminded of a quote, I think by George Bernard Shaw, and I may mangle it a little in recollection, who said that the reasonable man adapts himself to the world, and the unreasonable man adapts the world to himself. All progress depends on unreasonable men. And I think there are certainly aspects that we've heard about today in which Glenn Gould quite successfully adapted the world to himself in a way that to his friends or to people who worked with him may have seemed at times quite unreasonable, and yet we're the beneficiaries of the fruits of that adaptation. I'd like now to first of all give our panel an opportunity to respond to what they've heard from their colleagues here before giving you, who've been sitting here so patiently, a chance to put some questions to our panelists. So I'd like to open the floor first of all. Frank, you've been sitting the longest since you spoke.
Well, thanks very much. I want to say I think this has really been an extraordinary collection of observations, people looking at the same person through different windows. It is really, I think, a testament to the glorious indescribability of the individual human being, that we can sit here and expostulate as we do, and yet we all feel, I certainly feel, that we'll never really quite get to the essential man that we're talking about. And at the same time, the effort is really worth it, because this illumination that takes place, and I'm sitting here, I'm looking at Ryan and thinking about the paintings and his attempt to capture a genius and ending up just, well, there would be an endless succession of different views. And I think we're all really in that process. And I come away from this with a feeling of humility and respect for this man, and admiration, I think, for, and I think this is a message that comes from everyone, an extraordinary sense of admiration for this life. Now, having said that, I want to not exactly quibble, but I want to raise an issue about the matter of depression. And I was thinking about the play the other night, and this wonderful line where the middle Gould says, "Fish swim, birds fly, I play the piano." One of the things that I've learned in dealing with musicians, very talented musicians, is that they actually stand in awe of their own abilities. And when they start to lose this ability, when it seems to become undependable, they have an incredible sense of vulnerability about their worth, about the work that they're doing, about their own survival. And I would submit that, at least for consideration, that this erosion of his confidence around playing that took place over a period of time was a sort of protracted version of the experience that Icarus had as he extended his reach beyond where the physical apparatus that he had could possibly take him. It is extraordinary when you think that probably Gould really couldn't imagine where his ability came from. And it's really true of I think, great artists as well. And that this very, very particularly physical relationship, that is, his hands were really the bridge to the world, and they were his voice. And to have the difficulties that he did, to not be able to depend upon them, was to have something unaccountably torn out of himself, to have his magic taken away, in a sense. There is a magical sense of this ability that certainly musicians have. So when he became depressed, when he became anxious, when he became hypochondriacal, all of those other things, and this does not gainsay anything about whether he had Asperger's or not, and I think that Tim has made a really very, very persuasive case. The truth of the matter is that as a human being who had a special place in the world, that he was being shut off from the essence of his relationship with the world, and that it was a devastating experience for him. And I think that if he was depressed, the fact that he went on and that he found a way is a tribute to the creative psychology that he manufactured within himself. And I think this is maybe the big story, is that he kept reinventing a life for himself in spite of all these difficulties.
Thank you, Frank.
Yeah.
Helen.
It's very difficult for me whenever I have to kind of add one more syndrome, one more illness, one more symptom to Glenn Gould's existing problems. The other day, our friend from Germany called or summed up Glenn's problems in the word something like neurotic deficiencies. You have mentioned, Professor Jens. And even though today we don't use very much the term neurotic in psychiatry, we do use it in general conversation. I think that's what Glenn really had, all sorts of problems on that level. He had a strong social anxiety disorder, and he had all these other phobias and fears on axis 1 of classification. You know, I have axis 1 where you have different illnesses, axis 2, this is personality disorder. This is certain classification that we use in psychiatry. And I don't think that he had major mental illness of any kind, like schizophrenia or paranoid psychosis or anything of that kind. So when it comes to discussing the other syndrome, like infantile autism syndrome, I really have to do a lot of studying in the future to be able to either rule it out or to accept it. I cannot do it at this point. To think of Glenn as somebody who had no empathy, I think that is very kind of a absolute term. He had a lot of friends that would disagree with that. He was able to maintain relationships with some of them, such as, for example, Robert Silverman. I miss him here. He was Glenn's friend for 10 years, last 10 years of his life. Thought a world of him. He thought he was warm, he was giving. They never had conflicts. They saw each other and had long conversations face to face. They also have several phone calls and so on. He thought of Glenn as being extremely generous, personable, warm, hilarious, and easy to connect with, and so on. Several others, I spoke with Bruno Monsajon the other day, and he had no problems and no conflicts with Glenn whatsoever. When in the 60s, Czechoslovakian pianist immigrated to Canada, his name is Antonin Kubalek. Glenn met him here somewhere in the studio of the CBC, I believe, old studio on Jarvis Street. And recognizing the hardship that he was going through, hardship related to his immigration and trying to adjust here, Glenn sent him a check on $1,000, with a little note, spelling out some very warm words, something like, "I recognize your stress from immigration, and please do not take it the wrong way. I hope this will contribute in your starting this career." So lack of empathy that is one of the many features of Asperger's syndrome, and also something that was mentioned in the course of this conference, I think should be viewed relatively rather than absolutely. It was not an absolute feature. Relatively, from time to time, if the personal mix was not working, Glenn would withdraw from these people. Should be also viewed in the light of his depression. If he were depressed, did he feel like socializing? No. It should be viewed in the light of his anxiety, social anxiety disorder, social phobia. If he didn't go to the parties, if he didn't appear at some functions and so on, should that be looked like as kind of not liking people, not wanting to be with them, or not being able to be with them, which is a different thing because he simply had a very high anxiety. So I have great difficulties with infantile autism, not to mention very, very normal developmental milestones in his infancy. For example, he spoke before an average child could speak. He read notes and even scores and letters before an average child could do it. He played pata cake and peekaboo at the age of 6 months. It is known that children with infantile autism do not have normal developmental milestones. In fact, they are very late at that.
Although, Helen, I would have to say that there are some variants of autism which feature hyperlexia, where in fact the children may have advanced developmental milestones in particular areas. Just in the interest of time, and John, I understand we do have till 12:15, is that correct? If we need it. 12:10. Okay. Well, then I'm going to ask...
Still a lot of time.
Okay. I'm going to ask Tim and then Lynn for some comments as well.
As a musician and not a physician, I defer to the expertise of my esteemed colleagues. I would point out a couple of things, however. In the literature that describes Asperger's syndrome, among the various things that cause it to be viewed as a variant and quite different from autism, from the classical traits of infantile autism, is the ability in many of the sufferers to progress quite normally as infants and as in their early childhood, and many of these traits only show up later. Secondly, many of the traits are not suffered in their extreme varieties, which is, of course, another reason for the variation. And so if I left the impression that I thought that Glenn had no empathy, I wish to correct that impression now. I merely mean to suggest that he had deficits of varying degrees in each of the 10 characteristics that I addressed. So in my inexpert view, I feel that he matches the model pretty well. I did mention in the talk another area where he differed from classic Asperger's in that his musical gift was not fully formed at the beginning, and of course it evolved miraculously. Whereas many of the special talents of Asperger's sufferers are fully formed as very young people, but never progress. They have prodigious talents in calculating in mathematics or in drawing, whatever, and these talents don't progress. Obviously his did. I could go on at greater length, but time does not permit, so I'll stop there.
And Lynn?
I don't want to talk too much about clinical psychology because I haven't been practicing as a clinical psychologist for the past 10 years. I've been working as a Jungian, and we have quite different attitudes and a different sort of structure, mostly having to do with values and meaning and what makes a human being human, rather than what to do with a person that has a certain diagnosis. So I did what I felt I needed to do to get something that would cross the spectrum of Gould's behavior. But I'm not altogether happy with it, because certainly, as Tim has said, there were a number of areas where he was not predictable, where he had more or less of certain reactions. It seemed to depend, as it does, I think, for all of us, with the person that we're dealing with, the empathy that is or not, or can't be present, depending. And so you're never going to have a person who's completely linear, either too high or too low. And I think that with this very talented and yet disturbed young man, he had a lot of difficulty with working with people, and so when he was put in a spot or where he was working with more than a few people, he got anxious, and I think he displayed less empathy than he would otherwise. And one of the situations that I think I'd bring up would be the time that he went to Russia for the first time and was playing for a group of students who were still under the fare boat of the Soviet Union, which did not permit classic modern music. Gould was looking forward to presenting a concert of modern music, and wasn't about to change his program. So he played Schönberg, and the whispers started apparently, and got a bit louder. We want Beethoven, we want Mozart, we want a classical program. And one professor left, and others apparently got very nervous. Now, at the end of that program, the audience applauded and applauded and applauded and applauded. But Gould did have no awareness that those students were not happy with it. He was really so sure that this was the best concert he'd ever played in his life. And this is the situation that empathy was not functioning at all. That he knew what he had done, but he had no idea of what other people felt. And I think there were a fair number of situations like that in his life. But obviously not everything was like that, and people have recounted such warm stories of him that he was like all of us, to a certain extent, fluctuating. So I guess that's what I like to say.
Thank you. Now, we just have a couple of minutes left, but I would like to entertain some questions, sir.
I have one question to all of you, and I think most of us would like to know the answer. Did the intake of so many pills in Glenn's life have a direct effect on his early death?
Well, he had a thrombosis in his right middle cerebral artery. There was some evidence of some inflammatory change around what's called the cavernous sinus, which is a cavity through which the carotid artery goes. He just had a major blockage of that artery. I don't know that there's any way to connect specifically the terminal event in his life with the problematic experience that he had before. There certainly is a statistical association between hypertension and thrombotic disease, both in coronary and cerebral arteries. But I don't know that you can make a connection between the medications that he was taking and that specific event. I think probably, I was saying before earlier to our chairman, I thought he ought to address the polypharmacy issue since that's his field.
Well, I suspect nobody could keep an accurate account of exactly which medications Glenn Gould took at which time, prescribed by whom, and their direct effects. So I think it becomes really a voyage into the realm of extreme speculation to talk about the role of the various medications, when more plainly the documented reality of his essential hypertension was probably the most powerful determinant of the development of a stroke. Yes? Yes?
You've described many biochemical disorders, and these are transmitted. Have you found in any relatives or in members of the family anything, and you forgot Tourette syndrome, so remember that. But alcoholism, manic depression, is there anything in the family?
Yes, this is a very good question. There is a substantial history of major depression in his family, on his father's side and partly on his mother's side as well. His paternal uncle was greatly depressed. He was also has a great drinking problem, through which he also lost one of his arms, and he was a musician. That was a big tragedy in the family. Paternal aunt, which is Glenn's father's sister, has been very depressed for a number of years, to the point of being institutionalized and receiving shock treatment.
I think in the interest of time, we're going to take one more question, then I'm hopeful that our panelists will remain available for members of the audience to put individual questions to them. There's a question right there. There certainly is a section in the Ostwald biography that describes a brief and mercifully limited period where Gould was quite paranoid, a very brief interval, and one has to wonder about the effects, given the medications that he was taking at that time, either of intoxication or withdrawal, since he was self-regulating in that respect. I want to conclude our symposium now really simply by reflecting on the fact that Gould leaves us with a number of paradoxes which are unresolved even today. The solitude versus the relentless communication, the intellectualization versus the somatization, and the suffering versus the triumph. Our first response when we encounter mystery in trying to understand people is taxonomy. It's man's first response to ignorance at all times, is to desperately try to classify. And I think you've heard a number of taxonomical approaches to understanding Gould today. And as we wrap up, and as I thank our four speakers, I'm reminded also about what Sartre said when he said, "When you classify me, you destroy me." And bearing that in mind, I want to thank our panelists for shedding light and thought on someone who remains for us a wonderful source of mystery and reflection. Thank you all.
And David, to you and the panelists, really, thank you. This has been for me, it's been a wonderful finale to the sessions that have been this particular track. It's been great. Thank you. My final announcements are to remind you that your airline tickets, if you're going north tonight, and the concert tickets for this afternoon should be picked up right away. We ran short of sweatshirts, I know, this morning, and they have now brought in a fresh load. So if you haven't got your sweatshirt as a souvenir of your time with us, there are some sweatshirts in both colors and both sizes. Remember, it's 1:30. You should be here about 1:30. The concert begins at 1:45 this afternoon, and you're in for treats. I've heard the rehearsal. And again, to all of you who have been so kind to me and to my committee, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So wonderful.